The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A very good morning and a warm welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Juliana Tattlebaum here with Ian King this morning. These are your headlines. President Trump doubles down on his ambition to take Greenland after threatening 8 European countries with further tariffs if America doesn't own the island by June. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says European leaders will come around.
I believe that the Europeans will understand that this is best for Greenland, best for Europe, and best for the United States.
European leaders prepare for an emergency summit this week, with President Macron set to urge the bloc to impose nearly 100 billion euros in retaliatory tariffs. China hits its 5% growth target amid a boom in exports, but lagging domestic consumption casts a cloud over the data.
A very good morning to you. Ian, you chose a nice quiet morning to join me round set.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do you know, I used to work in newspapers, obviously, many moons ago, and we always had a running joke in Fleet Street that whenever it was the week of the Davos summit, there was always some massive news elsewhere in the world.
Well, this year proving no exception.
Yeah, well, at least President Trump's actually going to be in Davos, so he's going to take the story over there. But, well, what a week.
You make a fascinating point. Clearly, this is going to now dominate the discussions over in Switzerland, and a unique opportunity for the Europeans to see President Trump face to face. Clearly, this marks a major escalation. We knew President Trump was keen to move forward with Greenland. He certainly made that clear over the last couple of weeks. But this, over the weekend, I think took many investors by surprise. These new tariff threats suggesting that President Trump is going all guns blazing to go for it.
I think this is such a significant time. These are historic moments, really. I mean, this is the sort of whole post-war consensus, the NATO alliance under an existential threat. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
I think, we'll spend a lot of time throughout the show this morning discussing it, but one of the key questions to my mind is what's motivating President Trump? Is it really about Russia and China, as he's suggesting? Is it about the minerals? Is it because the midterms are fast approaching and he's struggling with the polls in the U.S.? Yeah,
I mean, there's this old expression in politics, the dead cat strategy, whereas you want to take people's minds off it, you chuck a dead cat on the table. I mean, Greenland is a pretty big dead cat to sort of distract American voters from any domestic concerns that they may have. I think there's a bit of his legacy in here as well, don't you? I mean, he's obviously influenced by McKinley in terms of the way that McKinley imposed tariffs. McKinley also oversaw an expansion of the US geographically, I think, didn't he? So maybe that's what's on his mind as well.
No, that's a fascinating point. Well, Ian, we will have the next 3 hours to hopefully flesh it out even more. For viewers, let me bring you up to speed with the latest. President Trump has threatened to impose an additional 10% levy on 8 European countries from February 1st if Denmark doesn't agree to a, quote, complete and total sale of Greenland. The U.S. leader warned the levy could rise to 25% on June 1st if no deal is reached, although no details have been announced. In a Truth Social post just this morning, the U.S. president said Denmark has been unable to do anything to stop Russian threats to the territory, despite being told to do so by NATO for the past 20 years. EU leaders will convene an emergency meeting this week in response to Trump's proposed tariffs, following a meeting of EU ambassadors in Brussels yesterday. European Council President Antonio Costa said consultations with member states over Greenland had reconfirmed the bloc's strong commitment to unity, peace, as well as a readiness to defend itself. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke to President Trump on Sunday night, telling him he was wrong to impose tariffs on NATO allies over Greenland. We'll hear more this morning when Starmer holds a press conference in Downing Street. Over the weekend, the UK Prime Minister said that the UK position on Greenland was clear and allies should do more together to address Russian threats across the Arctic. The 8 countries that would be affected by Trump's new tariffs issued a joint statement Sunday saying Trump's actions undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said he had spoken to the president regarding the security situation in Greenland and the Arctic. Meantime, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent laid out the administration's stance.
The European leaders will come around and they will understand that they need to be under the U.S. security umbrella. What would happen in Ukraine that if the U.S. pulled its support out? The whole thing would collapse. That the U.S., Kristen, to be clear, since 1980, the U.S. has spent U.S. military spending versus NATO military spending. We have spent $22 trillion more than the Europeans have. That we are peace through strength. And the Europeans now are only trying to play catch up. And that is only through President Trump. President Trump believes in NATO, but he does not believe in the American people being dragged in.
Well, Trump's Greenland threats look set to halt the ratification of the trade deal between the United States and the EU, with the president of the European People's Party saying its approval is not possible at this stage and calling for 0% tariffs on US products to be put on hold. Lawmakers are expected to approve freezing the deal at a meeting next Wednesday after previously delaying a decision. Well, as the EU weighs its response to Trump's threats, French President Emmanuel Macron is set to urge the bloc to use its so-called bazooka. The anti-coercion instrument has never been used before and would open the door to measures such as restrictions on investment. An option also reportedly under consideration is hitting Washington with €93 billion worth of tariffs, a reactivation of the measures that were halted after last summer's trade deal. Well, Greenland will be on the agenda when France's finance minister meets his German counterpart in Berlin today, before the bloc's finance ministers gather in Brussels later this week. Well, Annette and Charlotte are covering this story. Charlotte joins us live in the studio. Charlotte, it feels like Macron's really making the running in terms of the European response.
Yes, certainly having the tougher voice there. Maybe it's a good cop, bad cop game, but certainly coming with these very strong messages, the French president. And we have sources close to Roland Lescure, the French economy and finance minister, confirming that France will advocate for the use of the anti-coercion instrument, particularly starting to discuss this with his counterpart in Berlin today and try to bring other European partners on board with this. We had similar messages from the French trade minister yesterday as well on social media, talking about how Europe has the necessary trade levers to defend its interests. And here again, President Macron on X posting that tariff threats are unacceptable and have no place in this context. Europeans will respond in a united and coordinated manner should they be confirmed. So here again, very strong messaging here from President Macron. Again, using this instrument, as you were saying, called this trade bazooka. It has never been used since it was adopted in 2023. At the time was in response to Chinese pressure on Lithuania. So the kind of retaliatory measures they would have would be keeping American companies out of European procurement, for example, potential restriction on US tech companies. Now, the threshold is very high. You need 15 states to approve it, representing 65% of the EU's population. So here again, President Macron will have to convince several of his European partners in order to get this accepted. But certainly, again, strong message there from President Macron, one that has been advocate for appeasement with President Macron, with President Trump for many years, but it seems that he's changing his tone. Now, other measures, as you were just saying before, that they are looking at is potential 93 billion euros in tariffs on certain US products. So that's something that they had designed already back in July. They could resurface this. And of course, the hold of the EU-US trade deal that at the moment looks like the European Parliament does want to approve this. Now, President Macron spoke to Ursula von der Leyen yesterday. Of course, WEF will be incredibly important. The European leaders meeting President Macron. At the moment, President Macron is not meeting Trump. President Macron will be there on Tuesday. Trump is arriving on Wednesday. But certainly this will be a very important one before a potential extraordinary EU leaders meeting potentially later this week.
Charlotte, thank you for bringing us the French reaction. Let's get out to Annette now, who joins us live from Frankfurt with more on the German reaction. Annette, I was reading in Politico this morning that of the countries that deployed troops to Greenland last week, Germany has already withdrawn its contingent of just 15 soldiers. So when we talk about European deployment in Greenland that's allegedly triggered this response from President Trump, the number is tiny here. Talk to us a little bit more about how the Germans have responded this morning.
So far, what we heard over the weekend is more backroom diplomacy, what we are getting from the German government. So what they say, they've taken note of Trump's comment or the U.S. government's comment, and they now will align their interests with their European counterparts and then come up with countermeasures, but together with their European allies. So Friedrich Merz didn't step out. He actually did send his ministers. So the foreign minister appeared on public TV yesterday night and also made his way to Greenland. He just arrived early this morning to meet with their counterparts on the ground and also with people. And he is accompanied by a delegation of other foreign policy experts from the German government. So that's one part. And the other part, of course, is what the German economy and industry groups are saying. And for them, it will be a hard time because clearly, if we look at export volumes already last year, they're down 7% only with those tariffs enacted by August last year. And of course, an additional 10% of tariffs will be a major issue for especially the car industry, for example. And the market is already reflecting that. Interestingly, if you look at pre-market indications today, the Lang & Schwartz pre-market indications, then we are especially seeing car makers down tremendously. Daimler Truck is down by 3.5%. Commerzbank is as well down. Mercedes is down by more than 4%. Continental down 2%. Porsche down 2%. So it is especially hitting the cars and as well the financial industry, interestingly, because I think the market does speculate whether if the EU comes up with countermeasures on Wall Street, then there might actually be more impediments to make money for European banks also in the United States. That might be actually the rationale. So one thing is clear, it's bad for the market, it's bad for the economy, and only that comes at a time when there are some green sprouts for the German economy heading into this new year, because clearly we had a tough time the last 3 years, but 2026 was expected to actually see growth coming back to the country. Remains to be seen with that very difficult transatlantic relations and especially the tariff situation now unfolding. But again, as of now, the German government is rather reserved and does leave the global scene or the global stage to President Macron and also Ursula von der Leyen to actually express their frustrations and also express their willingness to actually stand up to the US government's approach.
Nessa, you rightfully point out the sectors that stand vulnerable to these tariffs. On the flip side, German defense, you've got to think that a rift of this size between the U.S. and the EU can only be a tailwind for the German defense companies. We'll talk more about that later on the show. Annette, thank you. Chris Southworth joins us now, Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce, UK. Chris, a very good morning. Thank you for being with us this morning. Let me kick off with your reaction to the developments over the weekend. The UK making the list of these 8 countries targeted with potential further tariffs from the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the UK has a lot of interest in this. So we're the largest economy and largest military presence on the northern flank of Europe. We're part of that NATO Northern Alliance. That's the 8 countries that are being threatened with tariffs. So we've got political interests, we've got economic interests, we've got defense interests, but we've also got constitutional interests, because don't forget Canada is also part of this conversation and they're part of the Commonwealth.
Chris, what about the way in which tariffs might be applied here by the US? We don't really have a lot of detail, do we, in terms of where this stands in relationship, for example, to the free trade deals that the UK and the US have struck and the EU are potentially going to strike, yet to be ratified, of course.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we have to be calm and diplomatic here, but don't forget the tariffs. Tariffs are just not welcome. Full stop. There's enough disruption going on out there for business, so we don't want more tariffs and don't need more tariffs, because this conversation around Greenland should be a joined-up conversation. It's in all of our economic, defence, and interests to find a solution to that problem. But don't forget the tariffs, and it's hard to keep track of the tariffs as well. Super complicated for anybody, let alone a business trying to navigate it all. But if you actually look at the raft of tariffs that were threatened last year, 2025, that can be anything from 10% up to 30%, depending on what country and sector you're in. In reality, that's 2 to 5% in the main. So that's how it's translated And then that sort of creeps up a bit to sort of 15% for some sectors like automotive. So the threat of tariff and the reality of tariff are two quite different things. And there's also tariffs that have been threatened and not actually been implemented. So there's no immediate guarantee that just because the US is threatening us all with tariffs, that actually those tariffs will happen. I think what we have to focus on is diplomacy and finding the appropriate solution.
Chris, you just mentioned autos there. Presumably, as regards the UK economy, that would be the sector you'd be most concerned for.
Well, steel and auto are the two, aren't they, that are getting thumped really hard from US tariffs. And again, absolutely unnecessary. The UK make actually, sort of value add cars to the US car market, and British steel is very specialist steel that the US don't make and require for some of their military equipment. So that doesn't make any sense either. We just need to have the conversation and support the conversation in diplomatic channels with the government. And not get into a tit for tat trade war. There are instruments that the Europeans certainly can use, but we have to be very attentive to the fact that we're all in trade deals. We have shared interests in the Arctic. It's not just about the US, it's much bigger than that. And we have constitutional responsibilities to also work with Canada in all of this as well.
Chris, you say that the best path from here is to take a diplomatic approach, but when you look at Keir Starmer over the last year, that's exactly what he's done. He's been incredibly conciliatory with regards to President Trump, but he nevertheless finds himself right in the same situation as these other 7 countries. So does that suggest that a change in tact is actually necessary, and maybe more public condemnation of President Trump's actions is actually the better course of action?
Yeah, well, actually, Keir Starmer's been more outspoken than he normally is. I think he's done a good job. I think that's probably the view of business. Is he's been quietly diplomatic in the background. I'm sure King Charles is involved in some of this as well. Don't forget that, particularly with interests around that Canada space. And he has been quite outspoken. We'll know more at 9 o'clock this morning when he speaks out from Number 10. But we just have to be. Take the temperature down, de-escalate the conversation, take it off social media, and just go through the proper diplomatic channels, because there's literally absolutely no reason whatsoever why the 8 countries that have all been named are in this conversation. We should be able to solve these problems very quickly. We're all friendly allies with each other.
One would think, but you certainly can't take anything for granted with this administration. When it comes to businesses, they have already been put through the ringer this year, whether it be with regards to what's happening on the international stage or here domestically with all the uncertainty around the UK budget, which came through in November. To what extent do you anticipate these potential tariffs to hang over confidence among business leaders in the UK and potentially handicap investment?
Well, it's all about agility in today's world. So, over the last 10, 20 years, we've just seen an increasing number of, large disruptive events, whether it was the economic crisis in 2008 or COVID or Brexit in the UK's case, and now it's tariffs. And interestingly, in terms of Greenland, it's actually about climate change, opening up new sea routes. The ice is thinning out, and we've now got new shipping lanes, which have enormous economic interest to all of us. So it's about living in that disruptive world. There's, looking forward in terms of the forecast over the next 10, 20 years, nobody's expecting a change to that, because the global economic order is changing. The roles of Russia and India and China, Europe and the US, it's all a moving feast as power changes and economic interests change. So businesses have to thrive and survive in that. And so it's absolutely critical that we don't have more disruptive events if we can avoid it. And we give them the tools to be able to move their finance, goods and services in and out of countries to protect their supply chains as quickly as possible, so that they don't have their cash trapped. They're not, exposed unnecessarily to interest rate hikes or exchange rate hikes or tariff rate hikes for that matter. So that's the future. In these sorts of situations, like I say, I think it's more about diplomacy in the first instance, not being retaliatory at this stage. And in the longer term, short to medium term, it's all about having the right policies in place, laws in place, and strategic frameworks in place to enable companies to be agile and more resilient.
Chris, appreciate the time this morning. Chris Southward, Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce, UK. CNBC is actually going to sit down with President Trump later this week at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We'll bring you that interview on Wednesday. And our coverage from the mountain kicks off tomorrow. We'll be speaking to top executives and policymakers throughout the day on CNBC, including the CEOs of LSEG, Commerce Bank, Novartis, and Standard Chartered, as well as IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. The theme at this year's World Economic Forum is the spirit of dialogue, a concept that looks set to be tested this week. For more on what to expect from Davos, check out CNBC.com. And coming up on this show, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer holds President Trump to account, telling him he's wrong to impose new tariffs before addressing the nation later this morning. Plus, China hits its growth target for the year, but you don't need to dig very far to see it's not all bright for Beijing. We'll be breaking down the numbers shortly, and we'll be diving into the European defense sector, with several stocks surging to near 20% returns in the opening week of the year. That conversation with the CFO of TKMS, Paul Glazer, at 8:20 GMT.
Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick, and here's the CEO of Siemens Energy, Christian Bruch.
Business leaders should not stay quiet in a world which is super complex. We sit in a privileged position, and we have to use that to ensure that a society remains prosperous, stable, successful.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this.
Welcome back. Well, we are expecting a sell-off at the open, as you can see from the futures prices. The land standout index there is the CAC 40 in France. That's called 2% lower at the open. The FTSE 100 off just over half of 1%, and the DAX in Germany off by 1.25% at the open there. So markets clearly fearing the worst. Now, it's obviously a bank holiday in the United States today. Markets are closed, so we wouldn't normally bother showing you the US futures, but there is activity going on there, as you can see from the screen there. The Nasdaq called 1% lower right now. The Dow Jones off 0.75%, and the S&P 500 off nearly 0.9% there. So markets obviously taking developments over the weekend, these threatened tariffs on 8 European countries with some degree of concern. Well, joining me now is Peter Toogood. He's Managing Director of Investments at the Fund Research Centre. Peter, welcome to you this morning. Thanks for joining us. I mean, we were going to talk about your outlook, which we will get on to, okay, sir. But what do you make of all this? I mean, the market's clearly a concern about this.
It's a real estate investor who uses coercion to get what he wants, and he's going to Davos on Wednesday. I mean, and we're all going completely bananas saying it's inevitable. And, oh, come on. I mean, it's what he does. Why is anyone in great shock at this? This is how he behaves. He doesn't have norms. He doesn't do diplomacy. He comes out and says, I want this, and I'm coming here on Wednesday, and you'll be nice to me and give me Greenland.
But what's interesting, though, is that
so, being glib, I don't wish to be glib, but it's sort of how it is. Yeah. And everyone's saying it's a given, and everyone's saying this is what's going to happen. Let's look at the last set of tariffs, headline numbers of X, Y, and Z, but they've not been real. It's only cars that have got that tariff. You actually, the effective tariff rate for the UK is about 3 to 4%. The dollar fell 10% last year. That was far more significant than the tariff rate.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think we need to sort of slightly balance up our thoughts around this. I mean, we may not like the behaviour, but we can sort of anticipate that's what's going to happen. And don't assume that it follows through. And jumping in the air and getting excitable, just all take a breath, or as your last guest said, calm down, and let's just do some diplomatic things to see what he really wants, which is he wants Greenland.
Do you think the fact that the tariffs that he's already imposed in his second term, they haven't really impacted US consumers thus far? Do you think that's what's potentially emboldened him this time around?
No, I think he just wants Greenland. I mean, put simply, there's a load of minerals there, and pretending it's anything to do with security, I think, is questionable. I suspect it's a lot to do with the minerals and the rare earths, because at the moment China has a stranglehold on these things, both for processing and actually the physicality of them, and that's a direct threat to the US. So in many senses, it's only going back to the blueprint that Trump was elected on, which is America first. And again, I love the sort of European and the UK approaches, the sheer shock that this is what is happening. Go and read what he said he was going to do. This is what he was going to do. And why everyone walks around in this continent surprised still amazes me. I'm not saying I particularly like watching it, but I think it was inevitable.
President Trump is pretty adept at telegraphing what he's going to do. You think back to Davos last year, and he said, it was all about energy prices then. He wanted energy to come down. He wanted gas prices to come down. He wanted the oil price to come down, and that is what's happened over the course of the year. You say Trump wants Greenland. That's it. That's what all of this is about. Is he going to get it? How does it play out?
I'm a geopolitical expert, not. It's what he wants, and I suspect by a series of conversations there'll be a way in which it's dealt with. A bigger presence. Maybe there's some joint thing that could be done. Physically grabbing land, that might be a stretch. But the reality is he can have most of what he wants by... There's 30,000 people in Greenland. I mean, let's be realistic. So as a base for what they want, and the argument of the Russia-China thing does make a lot of logical sense from everyone's perspective. And Europe has been at fault for over 50 years. It's enjoyed the peace dividend, it's not invested in what is required, and now it's the payback. And let's be honest, the Americans are right. Why should they be responsible for our defence? And there's no point pretending otherwise. It's just reality.
There certainly is a school of thought out there that this is ultimately just going to lead to a situation in which the Europeans say, okay, President Trump, you can have more access to Greenland, you can develop the mineral resources, you can invest here, that's fine, and we'll make a series of concessions to sort of appease you, and that's ultimately where we're going to land, not necessarily a full takeover of Greenland, to your point. But between now and that point, if that is what materializes, there certainly could be a lot of noise. So what does that mean from an investment perspective?
There'll be lots of noise all the time. What it means, well, let's look at it. M2 30-year high, fiscal easing everywhere. What is balanced budgets anymore? That's out of the window. Interest rates being cut, and let's not pretend QE isn't happening in America. It's, what is it, QE6 now or something? It's happening, and it's real. So fiscal easing, monetary largesse, all over the place, and that's not just here; it's everywhere. So the fact, look at Germany. Germany's now joined the fiscal party. So the fact is, you have an easing cycle. Whether we like the valuations or not, and an earnings yield in the US on the S&P of 3%, you can't possibly like it. Of course, the valuation's insane. So I'd stick with what I've been saying for over 2 or 3 years. Stick with value. Don't buy growth. Not interested in Mag 7 here either. Keep hold of gold because, let's be honest, there's fiscal deficits and they're expanding. And just play that game. Play rest of world, play gold. I wouldn't be particularly investing in the US. And if you are in the US, I'd look at a broadening and perhaps looking smaller, more equally weighted kind of exposures as opposed to what has driven. Because last year it wasn't Mag 7, it was actually Mag 3, wasn't it? Yeah. The others did nothing in practical terms. So already you're seeing the reality of it. And I would just stick with that because in volatile times, shorter duration investment makes more sense, and that's at the moment in the sort of value area.
Peter, you referenced the dollar earlier on. Do you anticipate the dollar falling again this year?
I would imagine by Trump's continuous process of doing what he does, it just makes people less interested in investing in the US, despite his protestations to the contrary. So, and he wants the weaker dollar. So he's encouraging it, and B, from a perspective of a global environment, look at what would you do if you were China? What would you do if you were the rest of the world? You'd start being less interested in investing in the US certainly for the next 2 or 3 years. And the latent threat here has to be later in this year that inflation comes back again. It may look very subdued for now, but I suspect, given that, let's be honest, President Trump is trying to create a boom to get the midterm sorted, you're going to have a mini boomlet in the US. And I think then later in the year that will lead to some inflationary concerns.
Peter, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us this morning. Peter Toogood, MD of Investments Fund Research Center.